He sweated when he smiled. But it wasn't sweat from his body, it was sweat from his soul. Something flowed from within him, as if his flesh betrayed what the crown tried to hide. A dark, silent fever that did not come from royal blood, but from that which is cultivated in the shadows of absolute power. Ferdinand VII was not born a monster. But when you look into the eyes of his history, you realize that something was lost too soon. Or perhaps revealed too soon. There was a pleasure in domination that went beyond politics, beyond the throne, beyond logic. A pleasure that was intoxicated by the fear of others, that fed on the fragility of the most defenseless bodies. A king who did not rule with laws, but with the basest instincts of human nature. Spain, shattered by wars, exile, and promises of freedom that were always betrayed, longed for stability, but found a depraved monarch obsessed with controlling everything that was flesh, body, pleasure, or humiliation. Inside the palaces, whispers did not speak of politics, but of intimate horrors. Decrees were not discussed, but stories were whispered behind tapestries. Of girls turned into spectacles, of wives reduced to sex puppets, of toys carved for private rituals. It was a reign of perverted desire, an empire of forced silence. Everything was seen, but nothing was said, because punishment was certain, and the king was unpredictable. What Ferdinand VII wanted, he took. What offended him, he destroyed. There was something deeply sick about his obsession with controlling bodies. The same man who abolished constitutions also collected the underwear of women hidden in his harem. The same king who restored the absolute monarchy also collected obscene drawings as if they were relics. Perversion was not just a trait, it was a system. And in this system, pleasure was not intimate. It was public, theatrical, used as punishment, as spectacle, as a tool of domination. The bodies of others were his arena of power. And Spain, chained to his will, watched in silence, fearing that any reaction would be read as treason. But no tyrant is born from a single act. Fernando was shaped, piece by piece, by a lineage of deformed kings, by a childhood where love was a bargaining chip and affection a game of manipulation. He grew up amid veiled incest, silent fears, and indifferent educators. He found himself desired and rejected, venerated and hated, and learned to survive by turning affection into punishment. From an early age, his gaze was lost in a labyrinth with no way out, where pleasure was always perverse and pain always desired. It is impossible to understand Fernando without entering this cracked mirror, where the soul hides behind gestures that hurt, touch, and corrupt. The question that echoes in every empty room of his palaces is as uncomfortable as it is inevitable. What happens to a man who never knew what limits were? What becomes of someone who, since childhood, saw the world bend to his most obscene whims? Fernando VII was not just a king. He was a distorted reflection of the decadence of a collapsing monarchy, an incarnation of power devouring itself amid lust, fear, and perversity. His story is not only repugnant, it is tragic, because it reveals the abyss where humanity dissolves. In this video, we will pass through the heavy curtains of history to enter the dark chambers of the soul of a king who confused the throne with the bedroom and love with submission. This is not a cheap scandal, but the anatomy of power corrupted by desire. A journey where every detail hides pain, and every silence screams. And you will discover that behind every gesture of Ferdinand VII, there is a dark pact between vice and the crown. If this descent into the depths of power touches you, like this video and write in the comments. Not every throne is sacred. In the center of the labyrinth, the king. His throne was not made of gold, but of opaque mirrors. Sitting on centuries of betrayals and broken pacts, Fernando VII did not see subjects, he saw bodies. The palace for him was more than a residence. It was an ornate cage, where silence licked the corridors like an obedient dog, and the doors opened not for visitors, but for exhibitions. Those who crossed its halls felt the weight of invisible surveillance, as if the king's eyes were in every crack in the wall. The female body, in his presence, ceased to be a person. It became a performance. Girls came as if they were flowers picked before spring, not to adorn, but to wither in his arms. Fernando demanded silence with his gaze, obedience with his breath. His pleasure lay in the surrender of others. Desire was born at the exact moment when the victim realized there was no escape. He fed on this, the breaking of will, the slow death of dignity. The walls knew. Carpets were washed with tears that never reached the floor. Curtains muffled screams. The marble staircase witnessed footsteps that hesitated, trembled, and were dragged. Servants remained silent, ladies averted their eyes, and advisors pretended not to see. Power was an acidic perfume, too intoxicating to allow morality. And the king, oblivious to humanity, consumed everything as if it were inevitable. But what seemed like perversion was also loneliness. Fernando neither loved nor trusted. He slept surrounded by servants and spies, waking up to nightmares that mixed the faces of women with the silhouettes of enemies. Pleasure was his way of forgetting, or punishing, what he never had. He knew no touch that healed, only that which dominated. And every night, between whispers and orders, he became more ferocious, more isolated, more a prisoner of his own lust. Inside him, the boy never grew up. He was buried under royal robes, suffocated by decrees, by the absence of affection, by political games that disfigure affection. His eroticism was not fantasy. It was a cry, a wordless plea for something he no longer knew how to name. But instead of seeking healing, he sought more spectacle. Perversion was the repetition of a wound that never healed, a blind ritual of self-annihilation. In the secret library, where he hid his notebooks with obscene drawings, were his most authentic portraits. Not the king in military uniform, but the naked man facing his own misery. He wrote orders with the same hand that drew chained bodies, as if paper were the only place where he dared to say what he was. There, among scribbles and graphic confessions, Fernando showed himself not as a king, but as a fractured creature. The women who passed through his life did not leave him, they fled in silence. Queen Maria Antonia, who was his wife while still a teenager, wasted away amid public and private humiliations. Others tried, unsuccessfully, to extract any trace of tenderness from him. But his touch was always punishment, his kiss always a wound, his womb always domination. None changed him. None survived intact. The palace then became a tomb. Not of stone, but of spirit. The king wandered through the halls like a ghost of himself. And every gilded wall that surrounded him was a cruel reminder that all excess is also an abyss. Fernando did not govern. He represented. He was the rotten mask of a Spain in decay, a king who hid his decadence behind empty rituals. The ceremonies were staged, the cross on his chest was an adornment without faith, and the decrees were a cloth covering exposed flesh. The people saw him as the symbol of restored order, but behind the scenes there was only disorder. The monarchy, with all its pomp, was just makeup on an open wound. The audience chambers became catwalks of humiliation. Women brought there did not know if they would be presented as ladies or offered as objects. The power Fernando wielded was not political, it was physical. He wanted everyone to know that his desire was law, that his perversions were untouchable. He created a reign where sex was not a natural desire, but a tool of oppression, as if each body were a map where he marked his presence. Spain, under his command, became a violated body. The people suffered from hunger and repression, but the king's concerns were elsewhere. New dances, new toys, new forms of intimate domination. The kingdom burned, but Fernando organized secret parties where wine flowed like blood and laughter was always forced. There was no truth in his court, only smiling masks covering exhausted eyes. The Inquisition, once feared, was now a toy in his hands. The confessions he demanded were not of faith, but of pleasure. Morality was distorted to the point that vice seemed virtue, and sin seemed purity. He created a system where obedience was born of fear and holiness of submission. Religion was a tool, and God a name invoked in vain between acts of cruelty. Even in his old age, Fernando did not relent. His body aged, but his thirst did not diminish. The girls kept coming. Many could not even read. Their fragile hands held flowers for the king, while he saw in them only fresh meat. Time did not redeem him, it only made him more meticulous, more cruel, more desperate. His pleasure was the only constant in a world that was falling apart. The doctors warned him about his health, but he laughed. His body rotted from within, his teeth fell out, his breath smelled of poison and disease, but his appetite remained. It was as if he wanted death to find him in the midst of what defined him: lust, domination, sin. And even when he could no longer stand upright, he demanded to be served like a god. The court remained silent, but Spain screamed. Not in the squares, for fear was greater than revolt, but in the eyes of a people who did not understand how such impunity could still exist. The king's perversion was no secret. It was an open wound that no one dared to treat. It was as if everyone were bound to him by an invisible thread of collective shame. And there stood the empire, an immense structure, sustained by dried blood and torn veils. The king, its rotten center. The walls, accomplices. The people, prisoners. Time, silent accomplice to a horror that still pulses beneath the rubble of the Spanish monarchy. Perversion does not spring from nowhere, it seeps. From father to son, from cradle to cradle, like a poison that is transmitted unseen. Fernando VII was the son of Carlos IV, grandson of Carlos III, and the blood that formed him was already diseased. He grew up amid bedroom intrigues, whispers between royal sheets, and lewd glances disguised as tenderness. His own mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, embroiled in scandals and rumors of adultery, turned the court into a theater of veiled lust. The boy Fernando learned early on that love was a currency, and that, in order to survive, he had to learn how to buy it. Childhood, that fertile ground where the soul learns what touch is, was a minefield for him. His toys were broken. Affection was absent. In his room, family portraits watched him like silent judges. No one touched him gently. Affection came in the form of manipulation. Words were traps. With each passing year, his tenderness withdrew into itself, like a cornered animal. And there, in the darkness of his soul, something began to deform. Not by nature, but by repetition. When the young prince was introduced to the art of politics, he did not learn principles. He learned blackmail. He did not learn ethics. He learned secrets. His first act of power was against his own father. With the support of conspirators, he betrayed Charles IV, setting himself up as the savior of a Spain that, in truth, he only wanted to dominate. There, the wounded boy became a vengeful man. A son who dethroned his father not to free the people, but to avenge his emotional abandonment. From the beginning, the throne was a symbol of revenge, not service. Then came Napoleon, and with him, exile. Fernando was taken to France as a prisoner, but it was a golden captivity. There, without a crown, without a homeland, without honor, he learned what it meant to be insignificant. But instead of learning humility, he swallowed his anger. He watched silently as the world forgot him. And he promised himself that when he returned, he would make everyone bow down. Not out of respect, but out of fear. When he returned to Spain, the country was wounded, but the king wanted revenge, not reconstruction. He abolished the Constitution of Cadiz, persecuted liberals, and restored absolutism with hands trembling with hatred. He did not want to rule, he wanted to control. And control, for him, was always intimate, always physical, always insatiable. Spain was not a nation. It was a body at his disposal. And the people were an inert mass that should only moan, never scream. His daughters, the fruits of his political and sick unions, did not escape the cruel logic of his power. Isabella II, the girl who would inherit the throne, was molded with the same coldness. From an early age, she was treated as a possession, not as a person. As if her destiny were tied to an invisible web of frustrated desires, rotten loyalties, and enforced silence. She would be queen, but before that, she would be the daughter of a ghost. The cycle was complete. The horror did not die. It reproduced itself. Fernando, who never knew how to love, created a lineage marked by rigidity, repression, and fear. His descendants would carry the weight of his unspoken choices, his never-confessed acts, his traumas turned into norms. The throne had become a curse. Spain, at that point, no longer had a king. It had a cracked mirror. a distorted reflection of everything that power can devour when it is deprived of a soul. And in that mirror, all who looked were in danger of losing themselves. In the last years of his life, Ferdinand VII became a living allegory of his own decline. Swollen, sick, repulsive, the king could barely move without help. His servants lifted him as if he were a corpse. His skin, yellow and sticky, exuded an odor that mixed urine, wine, and rotten meat. It was as if his body was demanding, with interest, all the offenses that his soul had accumulated. But not even the proximity of death was able to break his hunger for domination. Audiences became grotesque spectacles. The king, wrapped in heavy cloaks, sat on thrones adapted to disguise his physical weakness. His eyes, now dull, wandered between the legs of the courtesans. His words came out slowly, dripping like pus. Still, everyone bowed. Not out of respect, but out of terror. The illusion had to be fed until the end. No one dared to say that the king was already dead inside. Spain, meanwhile, was heading toward the abyss. Economic crises, political tensions, liberal movements. Everything was stifled under the thick curtain of a reign that was rotting in silence. Fernando was not a king at the end of his life. He was a symbol that refused to die. A corpse holding the reins of a burning horse. A patriarch who preferred to drag the country down with him rather than set it free. In private, his body became a scene of horror. Doctors treated him with scalding oils, bloodletting, vinegar compresses, and prayers. But nothing worked. The pain was constant, his urine was bloody, and his skin peeled off in layers. Even so, he demanded women. Not for sex, he was no longer able to perform, but to see them kneeling before him. It was the image of the dominion he had left. A morbid theater where the only character was his own delirium. His death was not a scream, it was a muffled sigh. The bells rang, but the people did not cry. In many homes, candles were lit not for mourning, but for relief. And in the servants' quarters, the silence was deeper than ever. Fernando VII left without confession, without forgiveness, without return. His departure was a cut, not with a sword but with time, as if a dark cycle had finally been interrupted. But his legacy did not fade away. It continued invisible, in the corridors of the following courts, in the rigidity of customs, in repressed sexuality, in silenced women, in pacts made in the shadows. The king's body rotted, but his spirit, or his absence, remained, impregnated like an odor that subsequent generations pretended not to smell. Today, little is said about Fernando VII. He is a name whispered in history classes, a faded figure in official portraits. But his mark is on the flesh of Spain, a deep scar that still throbs. A warning, perhaps, that when power marries perversion, kings become monsters, and palaces become cemeteries. And deep down, the mystery of Ferdinand VII may never have been about who he was, but about what we allowed him to become. The body of Ferdinand VII rotted, but not alone. With him, the invisible foundations of a Spain that preferred silence to facing its own illness also crumbled. The silence that surrounded him in life continued to echo after his death, like a spell that does not disappear with the absence of the sorcerer. The halls were swept clean, the portraits replaced, the notebooks burned. But there are things that cannot be erased with fire. They remain like smoke in the bones of history. There is no tombstone that can contain the extent of the damage caused by a man who confused pleasure with domination, and the body with the battlefield. Fernando VII was not just an isolated monster. He was a system, a reflection, a collective permission for power to exceed the limits of humanity. While he feasted on the pain of others, a nation learned to lower its eyes, bite its tongue, and survive on its knees. Spain was both victim and accomplice. The corridors of power became inverted wombs, where not life was gestated, but fear. And the king, swollen, feverish, bitter, was the final fruit of this sick womb. Instead of being born, he rotted. And even in death, he continued to reign in the form of a legacy. In the repression of bodies, in the silencing of women, in the shame passed down from generation to generation. But every ruin carries a seed. And this is where the image that will remain is born. The wall that cracks in silence. A crack that no one notices at first glance, but which grows with every breath. The wall is the palace. It is the system. It is the pact. And what opens there is not just stone. It is the cry that was never uttered. It is the memory that refuses to be forgotten. It is the womb of the earth saying, enough. Because every empire built on violation will one day tremble. Perhaps not in the time of the executioner, but in the time of the echo. And it is in the echo that we now find ourselves. In every woman who rediscovers her body. In every people who defies silence. In every whispered story that returns to the surface like a burning ember. Ferdinand VII went to his grave with his secrets, but his existence forces us to ask, how many kings still live in silence within the structures we accept? How many palaces remain standing because we fear what might collapse? It's not just about him. It's about us. About where we place the sacred, and where we pretend not to see the profane. May this story, then, serve not as spectacle, but as a mirror. Because there is a choice in each of us, to perpetuate the pact of silence, or to break it with our voices. And sometimes, the first crack comes from listening carefully. From the courage not to look away. If this narrative touched you in any way, if something inside you trembled as you walked through the dark corridors of this past, subscribe to the channel. Leave your experience, your discomfort, your reflection in the comments. And share this video with someone who needs to remember that not every throne deserves reverence. Because there are kings who are born of the people, and there are others who rot on top of them. And history never forgets.